Well, thank you all for the invitation. I just repeat, if any students want to give a talk instead of me, I'm happy to listen to you all. But in a pinch, yeah, I'm gonna give you another talk on one of my favorite topics. I'm a sociologist, but I like studying roads and other kinds of infrastructure. And I'm not a criminologist, even though I'm in the Department of Sociology and Criminology and Law. So Rodrigo can report back to the criminologist if he thinks I'm a competent criminologist. Because looking at infrastructure impacts, we stumbled into this topic, okay? And so I'm going to try and talk about criminology today as a neophyte criminologist, okay? So let's see here. Is that going to do it? Let's go down. I click, should find the mouse. Oh, if you can advance. There we go. There we go. Something that we all know happens if you try and cross disciplinary boundaries is you run into different literatures and they use different words and it's all fairly confusing. So you're going to get some talk from me about the confusing encounter between different literatures and thinking about infrastructure and crime, okay? These literatures you're probably familiar with. There's a lot of topic-specific literatures out there on illegal resource use. So there's a whole literature on illegal logging. There's a literature on land grabbing. There's a literature on illegal deforestation and mining and wildlife trafficking and a variety of other topics. And they tend to be fairly context-specific, right? So it's illegal logging in Bolivia, or it's illegal wildlife trafficking in Indonesia. And it's often very focused on the legal framework in that country that then serves to define what they mean by illegal, which could have a series of different kinds of definitions, right? So illegal logging could mean we're underreporting how much timber we're taking off the concession. It could mean, well, we're actually not taking timber off the concession, we're taking timber off the protected area next door. And there's a series of these kinds of definitions. So you have to read carefully into the empirical details as to what they mean, because they often mean very different things from one study to another. Oh, now I have the map, so I just go click. Okay, I'll figure this out eventually. Something that my criminology colleagues and some graduate students have pointed out to me is that there's a bunch of criminological literatures that are probably also useful to thinking about various forms of crime, okay, with regard to the environment. It took me a while to figure out that environmental criminology is not about natural resources and pollution and the biophysical environment. What those criminologists mean when they say environmental criminology is kind of the social context in which an offender does something that is illegal. And it could be in the context of a bar or in an intersection or a whole bunch of other things. Environmental there also may mean different times of the day, different days of the week, and things like that. It could be applied to what we think of as environmental topics in the context of TCD, but it took a while for us to do this translation that it wasn't necessarily environmental. But don't worry, there's other literatures out there. I don't know if you're familiar with the term green criminology, because that was kind of a complement to environmental criminology that, yes, now we'll focus on what people call green crimes. So now we're into things like what I was talking about a minute ago. Why do people dump illegally? Why do people traffic wildlife and things like that? But they come from very different theoretical perspectives, and they end up defining what counts as crime in very different ways. And I'm going to circle back to this at the end, because it's going to matter for some of the findings. In addition, there's white-collar crime. Environmental crime is often corporate crime. And there's fascinating and frightening studies out there about what happens inside a large corporation where decisions are made to illegally export illegally procured goods or to dump things where they shouldn't go. The long and cynical, or the short and cynical story there is upper management does tell middle management what to do. Middle management actually does it and then gets blamed if they get caught. Okay, so the challenge for the lawyers and others is to trace it back to the people who actually told the middle managers what to do. So the people who are actually responsible get brought to justice, and that's really hard. Okay, but it also has been applied in what's called the green collar crime literature when people look at specifically environmental crimes. And then there's the one that's become my personal favorite because it keeps coming up, is organized crime. There's been a lot of change in how criminal organizations and networks are operating and the business activities that they're involved in, which increasingly seem to involve things that folks in the TCD community are worried about, like what happens to wildlife and what happens in a mining project and things like that. Organized criminals who might have once upon a time been trafficking drugs or people or weapons have developed a taste for wildlife and cultural artifacts in environmentally sensitive places and things like that. And it's a business decision. Okay? All of these literatures are often cast at a pretty broad theoretical level, which is kind of a contrast to the other slide you just saw. But they're often very conceptually specific. And then they give you these big, long topologies of all the different things people may be doing that could be considered illegal. And so I see some complementarities there. So what does this have to do with infrastructure? There's a large literature out there, you probably may be aware, on the infrastructure impacts in terms of environmental outcomes and in terms of habitat loss, cars running over wildlife on freeways and things like that. You have runoff into watersheds, and you have changes in stream chemistry and all of this kind of stuff. Because of the manifold impacts, there's a lot of discussion that's kind of come up in parallel, of course, about environmental governance, whether we're talking about infrastructure or other kinds of development initiatives. And so I have found myself increasingly thinking about how those two sorts of literatures tend to cross. There's rather more out there on environmental governance than what I might call infrastructure governance, specifically focusing on what happens when you build a road in terms of governance. But if you get even more specific and think about crime in the context of governance and why crime happens, there's relatively little work on infrastructure and crime. And what there is, I was kind of surprised to find, has somewhat mixed findings. So I'm going to try and narrow the discussion here, and that's too far ahead. No. Click. There we go. In most research, one finds that if you have a new project, okay, it's usually followed by an increase in crime. And when people find this, they usually have one of or both of two explanations. One is simply it's easier to get access to the watershed or the forest or the mineral wealth or whatever it is, okay? But another more socioeconomic type explanation is that the benefits are not broadly shared. And this often characterizes poorly planned projects where those in the know, or those who are well connected, or those who can see the opportunities most early on, are the ones who benefit, and nobody else gets jobs, their livelihoods are threatened, and these kinds of things. And if people don't have other legal opportunities to support their livelihoods, they will do illegal things. Okay? But there is some research that does suggest that when you improve infrastructure, crime can actually go down. And one of the explanations for that is just the opposite side of the coin. If it's well planned and there's broadly shared benefits and everybody has a job, or it's a better job than before, you often see a decline in various forms of crime. But then there's other things like these sort of ancillary design considerations. If the infrastructure is carefully planned and designed, things like if there's improved lighting in your neighborhood, okay, one often also sees a decline in the amount of crime. All right, you can't really see it at the top. I'm jumping from one background section to the next. And now we're going to go to the Amazon. Okay. And those of you who have studied the region know that there's a whole lot of discussion about what amounts to illicit, illegal, unjust activities in the region's history. And I'm going to skate through the earlier literature on the colonization period and even up to the 20th century and development, and just summarize it, basically saying there's a whole lot of resource appropriation that goes on. Okay, much of that was illegal, or it was legally ambiguous, and there was a lot of various forms of violence that were involved, whether it was overt violence or slow forms of violence, because they both kind of highlight various forms of contestation and often replacement of one group of people and their way of governing their resources with another group of people. Think indigenous people or tribal or other local peoples, and then you get outsiders moving in. What I want to focus on instead is more recent work on illicit activities in the Amazon in a context where you have a state, it is present, there is a legal framework, okay, and we've learned some things from what happened in the earlier periods, okay. The big problem that comes up repeatedly is that law on the books is often well scripted and defines in great detail what you can and cannot do, and so we know if we're compliant or not. The real challenge is more having to do with state capacity or enforcement effort, okay, and how policing and other forms of regulation actually unfold. And so we end up with all these sort of topic-specific literatures, right? There's illegal deforestation, there's illegal logging, there's illegal mining, and the specifics by which they're defined, okay? I also want to call attention to recent work on organized crime, because as I mentioned earlier, there's kind of this diversified business model out there. I should say arrival of additional criminal networks and groups in the Amazon in the last 10, 15 years, okay, on top of those that were already kind of there. They have fairly diverse origins. If you know about organized crime in Brazil, you know many of them came from prisons in southern Brazil, especially Sao Paulo, and they have sort of disseminated north, especially the Comando Vermelho, but there's also the Família do Norte, and there's certain other groups that have moved around the country, often along infrastructure corridors. And they engage in increasingly diverse kinds of activities, usually starting with drug trafficking, but then moving into other kinds of activities, moving people, wildlife, timber, and stuff like that. And so this kind of crosses then with these infrastructure projects in the Amazon, and I'll say a little bit more about those here in a minute. And there's been debate about them. People usually, if I can summarize the literature, people say, well, there's positive economic outcomes and there's negative social and environmental outcomes, okay? Some of this involves crime to the extent that specific kinds of crime about specific resources are noted in some of these previous literatures that were just noted. But a focus on crime and a developed discussion of that is something I think we need, as opposed to just these topic-specific discussions. So if you're in the room, it's harder to see. That's the Interoceanic Highway up there. This is this road I've been studying for a long time. It was an emblematic but controversial project in the Initiative for the Integration of Regional Infrastructure in South America, or IRSA. It was intensely debated. It was going to cost a lot of money to build, and it was very quickly planned, licensed, contracted, and built in the late 2000s into one of the relatively remote regions of the Amazon, where there hadn't been a paved road until just then, okay? And you can kind of see it running through here. I note that there was an inadequate budget for governance. This is what independent NGOs concluded. Then there was a mitigation budget, and that was also concluded to be insufficient for a project of this size. It was originally budgeted for about 900 million, and if you know the rest of the story, it ended up costing more than that, okay? But these budgets were somewhere around 10 million apiece, so they were used fairly inadequate. And there's a whole bunch of literature out there on the good things that happen and the bad things that happen and what we make of all of this. I'm going to skate past that and just say, if we read the research literature about the Interoceanica, what do we learn? One, there's a whole bunch of remote sensing studies that say, yes, deforestation increased, and much of it was for agriculture. Okay, good. Second, there was a lot of illegal mining, especially in Madre de Dios. So you can see here the highway goes through this map card image, and there's the little settlement, and there's the mining. Okay, so fairly clear association between the road and mining, which was at best informal and often illegal. A similar kind of story about logging. Okay, large sawmill. There's the highway at the top right, and you can see all the stacked up logs in this image. Okay? Similarly, there was a lot of immigration, there was a lot of urban population, a lot of land settlement. Some people would call them invasions. This is Puerto Maldonado in Madre de Dios. The highway you can see goes right through it. Most of this growth is in the last 15 years, most of this across the river. So the city really did expand. And you can see the usual signs along the roadside. Hey, our settlement's legal, we swear, the sign says so, type stuff. Okay. And of course, then there was Jato, the whole corruption scandal that had its various consequences up to and including the Peruvian political crisis a couple of years ago, right? So that's what we know. Now, what if you ask the local people along the road? And you have to find, there's a line here, there's a line there in a lot of these publications. There's actually not a whole lot known what people in the affected region thought about all this. So a couple of colleagues of mine, Elsa Mendoza, who I've been working with on and off for a long time, decided, well, we're going to go visit all these places and we're going to go ask these people what they thought. Okay. So we conducted about 9 workshops in different communities along the highway, and they averaged about 30 participants per. We specifically sought to recruit through local contacts, organizational representatives, current and former politicians, representatives of communities. So you kind of got the classic key informant, okay? And we just asked them, we handed out a bunch of cards and asked, well, what did you think of the highway? What did you think was good? And let them fill out their cards, and then asked them what they thought was bad. So here's the map that we went along the road, especially in Madre de Dios, which is where a big chunk of the money was spent under IRSA, but also over Acre. So now I'm going to give you pictures. Here we are. The yellow cards are the cards where somebody says something was a negative outcome, whatever they thought that was. And the green cards are the positives. And you can decide how many of each there were, but there were a lot of both. Okay? So there's Mazuco, here's Santa Rosa. Some of these areas are out in the mining areas. They also worked on some maps so they could tell us where the good things were and where the bad things were, and they could point out certain critical areas. Okay? This is in Puerto Maldonado, where almost everybody seemed to be from the government or the NGOs. And then we went up into smaller pioneer communities in places like Planchon and Mávila, if you know the region. Okay? Ended up in Iberia, that has a stronger government presence, and listened to the folks there. Okay? Here's some of the maps where people kind of got to draw. Some people brought their kids. That was fun to watch. No, the yellow goes over here type stuff. So it was a family affair to some extent. And you can see this is an economic map. It looks resource oriented. But then we just started coding. And we coded ourselves, what were the social impacts, what were the infrastructural impacts, what were economic, what were environmental. These are the top 10 most commonly noted positive impacts, and I apologize for the tiny letters. Not surprisingly, the main benefit people saw was it was a lot easier to get around. Okay, not a shock there, but it's useful to confirm. The next one had to do with economic growth. The third one, people commented on it was easier to grow and move their agricultural produce. Other people talked about social services. These findings map pretty nicely, actually, on the research literature as well as the policy debates about what would be a benefit to paving the road. And then we get the red bars here, and these are the things that people thought were problems. Okay, and deforestation's there. Some other illegal kinds of activities are there, but number one had to do with violence, various kinds of violence. Okay, so there's threats, assault, murder, rape, stuff like that, by a fair margin, actually. After that, you get an environmental topic, but it's environmental pollution. People were very concerned about air and water pollution and things like that. Then we had in-migration of, people talked a lot about the desconocidos. Who are these people? Where do they come from? Okay. We did have drug trafficking, but it's not until you get to number 5 that we get deforestation, fires, and stuff like this. So it was a somewhat different set of concerns and priorities when we came to what were the problems than one finds out in the research literature. And so this is what set us on thinking, well, why are they all worried about crime? What is this business exactly? For whatever it's worth, there's the ad. We published this a couple of years ago in World Development. So if you want to go dig this up, you can see more details in there. But it was that finding on the previous slide. What are people talking about in that big tall bar about all of this violence and other things? And so I wanted to go back and take a little bit more of a criminological perspective and unpack some of this stuff, as well as the other kinds of activities that were viewed as negative, because not all the deforestation comments actually said it was illegal. They were just concerned about deforestation for other reasons. So if you start separating these things out and you redo the coding specifically focusing on when somebody said something was illegal or illicit, then what do we find? And so we have to unpack the environmental crimes, in a physical sense now, but also various forms of organized crime, which really amount to like various kinds of trafficking, and then these different kinds of what I'll call interpersonal crimes. Criminologists call them street crimes, but there you go, okay? And things like traffic infractions that they did talk about, maybe not as serious as the other kinds of crime, but they're still there. And then, of course, political corruption. So if you do that, this is what happens. Even if we narrow down the definition here of asaltos or robos and delincuencia, these kinds of terms that people use interchangeably, you still find a lot of people talking about that. So when you take out murder and rape and these things over here, they were relatively uncommonly noted. The recoding still confirms that there was a lot of stuff going on that people associated with the arrival of the road. So this is just various comments on illicit activities now. Right? One thing that was interesting that comes up is deforestation is way over here now. There were a lot of comments on deforestation. Relatively few were about illegal deforestation. We'll come back to that topic in a minute. You do have quite a bit of comments on land invasions that were viewed as illegal. Illegal mining is still there, corruption. But some of these bars go down more than others. I'm intrigued about which ones go down and which ones didn't. Okay. Assaults, violence didn't. Deforestation did a fair bit. So let me move to some interpretations and I'll sit down and let y'all ask questions. It's really important in the criminological literature to draw a distinction between environmental crime and environmental harm. Okay? The environmental criminology literature and most of mainstream criminology will define crime in legalistic terms, right? What is the crime on the books? What is the list of things that loggers are doing that may be illegal? Okay. But if you look at the green criminology literature, they will make an argument that stems from the critical criminology tradition, which in many ways resembles some of the theoretical antecedents of political ecology, and argue for a broader definition of what is problematic about things people do to the environment. So environmental harm is their definition. Anything that is harmful to the environment should be viewed as criminal, okay, even if it's not legally defined as such. So this begins to explain that gap between people talking about deforestation as a problem and people specifically talking about illegal deforestation under a legalistic definition. There's interesting opportunities for dialogue there among theoretical perspectives about crime and harm. Another key finding that people commented a lot about was to relate the interpersonal, the street crime, the robos, delincuencia, this kind of thing to organized crime. People viewed the two as highly connected. I cut off one of the pictures, even though y'all told me you put the thing there. But Perz is among the facções, as they call them, in Acre that have arrived in recent years. And you have members engaging in various kinds of street crime as well as more organized crime. So the distinction between interpersonal crime and street crime on the one hand and organized crime on the other gets blurry here, because it's often members of trafficking groups that are actually doing other things than just trafficking. So focusing then on organized crime in terms of what the trafficking is, there were people talking about different kinds of trafficking, some of which involve resources and whatnot, but there was also a lot of discussion of drugs and human trafficking, often linked to prostitution, okay? But there was a lot of environmental crime that was involved in trafficking too. So we're falsifying documents to get the logs out, gold, moving wildlife, and things like that. Interestingly, this reflects a lot of the recent shifts and emphasis in criminological work on organized crime. I've already mentioned the diversified business models. They were doing one thing, now we're going to go into something else. You see some networks doing more than one of these things. Okay? Similarly, there's kind of an increase in scale on which there many organized crime groups are operating, a shift from local racketeering type things in neighborhoods to long distance trafficking, especially along road corridors and things like that. And so this is where this concept of do you go by river, do you go by road, it increasingly means you're going to go by road, especially if governance seems weak. So a couple concluding slides then. One is reiterating, we know that infrastructure is challenging to govern, especially if you're in a place like the Amazon, okay? And if you have inadequate measures and investments in governance and mitigation and things like that, you're going to get a fair amount of crime because organized criminals are watching and they're going to take advantage of these sorts of things. But it's not just environmental crime or environmental harm, depending on your theoretical perspective, as much as the Amazonian literature tends to focus on that. There's also, as you saw in those tall bars, no matter how you do the coding, a lot of reporting by stakeholders on what I'm going to characterize as threats to public safety. Okay, so can you walk in the street and this sort of thing. And so I think there's a couple opportunities here. One is that there's different literatures that speak in different ways to how we can understand crime in the context of development, infrastructure, environmental change. Okay, not only within criminology, where there's these different perspectives on what counts as crime, and do you characterize what is illegal in terms of a legal framework or in terms of environmental harm, but there's also the opportunity to relate topic-specific literatures on logging and mining and things like that to these broader theoretical frameworks. And finally, if you ever find yourself in a position to argue against what appears to be a badly planned infrastructure project, okay, one avenue, of course, as many conservation NGOs have done, is to argue about the prospective environmental impacts. But I would submit another one is to call attention to the public safety problem. Because if policing infrastructure and other kinds of elements of regulation and law enforcement are inadequate or unprepared, then you are probably going to have situations where a lot of people are going to get sick. And that might strike home a lot faster than somebody might pollute a stream somewhere. Okay? So the public safety issue is one of the parts of the take-home message I want to suggest, a debate about infrastructure that looks quickly or badly. So I'm going to stop there. I don't know if this put everybody to sleep or this was interesting, or I'm a totally confused person who's an attempted criminologist, but happy to take any questions.